Good afternoon, GA students. Welcome to Mr. Marasco's Man Cave. Down here with my Notre Dame memorabilia. Behind me I have a shelf with many pieces of my past that I've collected over the years. So I wanted to just be down here today and share a story with you. Before I share my story with you today, my room has 132 college football helmets. I collect them. I have all Division I schools. So I'm going to give you a quiz. And I'm going to start out with an easy one today. You have to name this helmet. And the first person who can get back with me with the name of this university gets the prize. I'll give you a hint that this one is from the state of Michigan. So those of you, take a good look at it and let me know what school in the state of Michigan this helmet belongs to you. All right, now, how many of you have ever heard of the expression, win one for the Gipper? I know it's very popular in some movies, and it's kind of a common saying for when a team is about to take the field and they're going to try to win a game and they're the underdog and no one's giving them a chance. And you ever wonder where that expression came from and the story behind win one for the Gipper? So I'm going to share with you the story called The Gipper, America's football hero. Like most boys who lived in northern Michigan during the early 1900s, George Gipp played basketball and baseball and football. From the time he was a small boy, George ran faster than most everyone. He could throw a ball farther too, and because he could dash and dodge on a dime, no one could ever catch him. When George was older, baseball was his game. People came from miles around to watch him crack the ball over the fence and run the bases in one easy move. George was such a talented baseball player that when he became a young man, he was awarded a scholarship to the University of Notre Dame. This meant a free education, and as long as he played baseball for the school, he could play. So in the autumn of 1916, George left home for South Bend, Indiana. When he stepped onto the campus for the first time, George did not know what to expect. One day after class, George and a schoolmate were kicking a football around for fun. It did not take long for Newt Rockne, an assistant football coach, much time to notice George. George kicked the ball high and straight, and then he tossed it far and steady, never missing his target. From not too far away, Newt, or the Rock as they called him, stood admiring this young man. He seemed to be all bone and muscle, yet quick and light on his feet. "What is your name?" asked the Rock. "Gipp, George Gipp." Then Rock asked George if he played football in high school, and George replied, "No, don't particularly care for football. Baseball is my dish." "Well," invited Rock, "put on a football suit tomorrow and come out with the freshman scrubs. I think I'll make you a football player," he said. Deciding to give it a chance, George showed up for practice the next day. Once on the field, he raced like a runaway colt, dodging his way through players to make a touchdown. As everyone watched in amazement, George decided he liked playing football, and he joined the University of Notre Dame's football team. In one of the early season games, Notre Dame was matched against Western State Normal, which is today's Western Michigan University. Notre Dame and Western were tied at 7-7. And with less than 3 minutes left, the Notre Dame quarterback was happy to settle for a tie score. So he told George to punt, which means to kick the ball only a short distance. But George didn't want to settle for a tie. So he asked the quarterback if he could drop kick the ball for a win. Although the quarterback urged him to punt, George lined up the ball and thought about winning. He pulled his foot back and drop-kicked the pigskin with all his might. The ball sailed for 62 yards, sailing through the crossbar for 3 points and giving Notre Dame the 10-7 win. At that moment, Knute Rockne knew that George was a special gift. George Gipp played not only with his body and mind, he also played with his heart. The next day, George's drop back made headlines across the nation as one of the longest ever recorded in history. Everyone thought George Gipp was a football sensation. And George became a sensation off the field too. When he wasn't playing football or going to class, he played pool and card games with people from town. Sometimes if he won money, he bought dinner for people who didn't have enough. The students at Notre Dame and the people of South Bend and football fans across the nation loved George Gipp. And George Gipp loved football. Although it was baseball that brought George to the University of Notre Dame, he decided it was football was the sport that he would play. So in 1918, George's second season, Knute Rockne became the head coach of the team. And he and George grew to be good friends and football partners. Game after game, George was unstoppable on the field. In October of 1920, George's fourth and final year at Notre Dame, the team traveled to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Tension filled the air as the Notre Dame players prepared to meet their long-standing rival, the Army Cadets. As both teams entered the field, the stadium was filled with cheers. But when the game began, the Notre Dame players were met with one crushing blow after another. At halftime, the tired Notre Dame team was down 14-17, and it looked like they were going to lose. But George was not going to let that happen. When he came out in the second half, he came out fighting like a giant, with quick passes and pounding tackles. George delivered at every step, advancing his team forward. In the final quarter, Notre Dame made a touchdown, and George kicked for an extra point, setting the score to 21-17. But George wanted more, and with a fake cross play, Gipp and his teammates made one more touchdown. With moments left and the win apparent, Knute called George out of the game so he could rest. George staggered towards the sidelines, tired, bloody, and satisfied. And as he stepped off the field, the entire crowd in the stadium came to their feet without making a sound. Nobody applauded and nobody cheered. Both sides were in such awe of the mighty George Gipp, and they honored him with a silent tribute. The next day, newspaper headlines around the country said George Gipp was one of the best football players ever. But several games later, as the team prepared for a game against Northwestern, George was not feeling well. His throat was sore, his body was weak, and he had a fever. Knute was worried. He told George that if he wasn't feeling better when they got to the game, he would not be expected to play. When they arrived in Chicago for the game, George was still not feeling well, so he sat on the sidelines. But the day had been reserved for George Gipp Day, and people from all over came to see him play. Wrapped in a wool blanket, George shook his chills and his burning fever. But since they didn't know he was sick, fans began to grumble as they saw him on the sidelines. During the game, a few voices started to call, "We want Gipp! We want Gipp!" It wasn't long before the crowd noises joined in, and soon the whole crowd was calling for George Gipp to play. The wind was ice-cutting cold, and George's throat felt sharp and burning tight. But he did not want to disappoint the crowd. Near the end of the game, George removed his blanket and slowly stepped onto the field to the sound of great cheers. Joining the other players and gathering all the strength he could muster, he worked to make a perfect pass for 35 yards and a touchdown. Minutes later, he threw another pass, this time for 70 yards. But inside, George was growing weaker and weaker by the minute. 2 days later, a very sick George showed up at a banquet being in honor of the Notre Dame team. The pain and fever had worsened, so he told Newt that he needed to go to the hospital. By the time he arrived, George was a very sick man. The doctor said he had a bad case of tonsillitis. 1 week later, the hospital bulletin stated that he had pneumonia and a serious throat infection. Across the nation, newspapers sent out word of George's condition, and reporters camped outside the hospital for updates. Meanwhile, George had been named the All-American team and one of the greatest football honors at the time, but George was too sick to celebrate the good news. In Michigan's hometown, the local newspaper office printed cards with the good news of George being an All-American. While George remained in the hospital, Newt was a regular visitor. Over the next 2 weeks, he watched George's condition grow worse, and the once strong, muscular young man became thin and pale. One night, as his family and Newt stood quietly by, George motioned to Newt to come closer. Then, as Newt leaned towards his friend, George Gipp whispered something in his ear. Hours later, the card in the newspaper window of George's hometown simply said, "George Gipp has died." Newt Rockne didn't tell anyone what George Gipp had said as he passed away. Keeping true to George's last request, he waited for just the right moment to let George's final thoughts be known. And 8 years later, that moment came. Newt was still the head coach for Notre Dame, and his team was struggling at West Point against the Army Cadets, his rival team. The Notre Dame team was lacking in spirit that day, drive, strength, and they were behind in the first half, and the win looked hopeless. So at halftime, Newt called the team together in a huddle in the locker room floor. The boys were feeling beaten, tired, discouraged, as Newt began to speak. "Boys, I want to tell you a story. I never thought I would have to tell it, but the time has come." Then he told them what George Gipp whispered in his ear the night that he died. "I've got to go, Rock. It's all right. I'm afraid. Sometimes, Rock, when the team is up against it, and when things are wrong and the breaks are beating the boys, tell them to go out there and win all they've got and just win one for the Gipper. I don't know where I'll be then, Rock, but I know about it, and I'll be happy." The players were silent, and the spirit of George Gipp filled the room. The young men thought about this last words, and they fought back the tears, because everyone knew about George Gipp. And then Newt Rockne looked at them and said, "This is the day. You are the team." With a roar of determination, the Notre Dame team exploded onto the field for the second half. The team worked its way down the field until they neared the opponent's end zone. And on fourth down, Notre Dame lined up at the 1-yard line, and the fullback was handed the ball. He plunged hard into the end zone, where he slammed himself into the ground, and the ball followed right behind him. As the ball hit the grass, he yelled out the legendary words, "That one's for the Gipper." With new life, an inspired Notre Dame team went on to beat Army. And that's one for the Gipper and one for always. And now you know the story about George Gipp and win one for the Gipper. Enjoy, have a great day, and I'll see you next week with another story.